There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them. It has clear edges. It has villains who wore specific uniforms and heroes who liberated specific places. It has a beginning marked by invasion and an end marked by surrender. It was documented, photographed, filmed, and then taught in schools across the democratic world as perhaps the most morally unambiguous conflict in modern history. Good defeated evil. The right side won. The machinery of barbarism was dismantled, and the world moved forward having learned something essential about what human beings must never again allow. That version is not false, but it is incomplete in ways that were not accidental. What was omitted from the official record of World War II was not omitted because it was irrelevant. It was omitted because it was inconvenient, because it complicated the narrative that victorious governments needed to construct in order to justify the cost of the war, to manage their own populations, and to begin building a post-war world in which the people who had made certain decisions were still in positions of authority and still needed to be trusted. The suppression of specific facts about World War II was itself a bureaucratic process. It involved classification systems, archival restrictions, official agreements between allied governments, legal frameworks that shielded individuals from accountability, and in some cases, the quiet destruction of documents that recorded things no official history was ever intended to include. What follows is not a story about monsters. Monsters are too easy. What follows is a story about systems, about how institutions function when the rules governing ordinary behavior are suspended, about how paperwork can authorize the unthinkable, about how repetition turns the extraordinary into the routine, about how the most disturbing feature of industrialized warfare was not its chaos, but its order. The war was organized. That is the thing that tends to get lost. The atrocities of World War II were not the product of disorder. They were the product of the same human capacity for systematic, hierarchical, procedural behavior that builds hospitals and runs railroads and fills out tax forms. The people who administered the worst of what happened during those 6 years were, in most cases, not experiencing psychological breakdowns. They were doing their jobs. They were following protocols. They were filing reports. They were meeting deadlines. And in many cases, when the war ended, they went home and continued doing those things in different institutional contexts, because the skills required to manage large-scale organized violence are not entirely different from the skills required to manage large-scale organized peacetime activity. That is where we begin, not with the battle, with the office, with the form, with the procedure, with the stamp on the document that authorized what happened next. The first thing that tends to be suppressed about any major conflict is the degree to which both sides shared operational assumptions. This is particularly uncomfortable in the context of World War II because the war was defined, at least in its popular memory, by the absolute difference between the Allied powers and the Axis powers. And there were real differences. The Holocaust was not a policy equivalent to anything the Allies formally implemented. The systematic murder of European Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners and others in the Nazi extermination apparatus had no direct Allied parallel in terms of scale or intent. But the assumption of absolute moral separation between Allied and Axis conduct required the active suppression of a significant amount of information about what Allied forces actually did during the war, how they did it, who authorized it, and what happened to the people responsible when the war ended. The strategic bombing campaigns conducted by British and American air forces against German and Japanese civilian populations were, by the standards that the Allied powers themselves applied at the Nuremberg trials, acts that raised serious questions about legality and proportionality. This was understood at the time by people inside the institutions that were planning and executing those campaigns. The debate about strategic bombing was not a post-war invention. It was happening in real time, inside the offices of the British Air Ministry, inside the planning divisions of the United States Army Air Forces, and in the private correspondence of senior commanders who understood exactly what they were ordering. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 is the most frequently cited example, but it was not an anomaly. It was a data point in a campaign that had been running for years and that had, by early 1945, developed a refined methodology for the destruction of urban areas. The RAF and the USAAF had learned, through accumulated operational experience, exactly how to structure an attack on a city to produce maximum destruction. The first wave would drop high explosives to blow out windows and doors and damage roofs. The second wave would drop incendiaries into the exposed interiors of buildings. The fires would merge. The heat would create conditions in which the fire generated its own wind, drawing oxygen toward the center of the conflagration, feeding itself, pulling people who were running away back toward the flames. The firestorm was not an accidental byproduct of the bombing campaign. By the time Dresden was attacked, the firestorm was understood as a tactical goal. The official casualty figures for Dresden were adjusted multiple times. The first estimates, which circulated in the days immediately after the attack and were reported by German sources, placed the death toll at numbers that would have made the bombing of Dresden one of the single deadliest events of the entire war. British and American authorities issued responses to those figures that emphasized German propagandistic intent. The eventual official estimates settled on numbers significantly lower than early German claims. Those official numbers have since been revised again, and the process of revision itself reflects an ongoing institutional management of how the event is categorized and remembered. What is not disputed is that a significant number of German civilians died in Dresden in February 1945. What remains contested, in ways that are not entirely separable from political interest, is exactly how many and exactly why the operation was ordered when the war was already, by all military assessments, effectively decided. The documentation surrounding the decision to bomb Dresden was classified for decades. When portions of it became available, what emerged was a picture of an institution that was not simply prosecuting a military campaign, but was also managing its own internal doubts about the legitimacy of what it was doing. The memos exist. The questions were asked. The answers that were given within those memos were answers designed to preserve the legal and moral framework within which the bombing campaign could continue to be authorized. The people writing those memos were not confused about what was happening. They were managing the documentation of what was happening. That is a different thing entirely, and it is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of World War II, in ways that were specifically suppressed because they did not fit the post-war narrative that the victorious powers needed to construct. The Allied bombing campaign against Japan produced destruction on a scale that exceeded the European campaign in specific incidents. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and into March 10th, 1945, was directed by General Curtis LeMay and was executed with a clarity of purpose that the operational record makes no attempt to disguise. LeMay had analyzed the results of precision daylight bombing against Japanese industrial targets and determined that it was producing insufficient damage at excessive cost. He changed the approach. He loaded his B-29s with incendiary bombs rather than high explosives. He sent them in at low altitude at night to avoid Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. He targeted the densely packed residential areas of Tokyo rather than specific industrial facilities, because the residential areas were where the cottage industries and small workshops that fed Japanese war production were located, and because those areas burned. In a single night, the firebombing of Tokyo killed more people than either of the atomic bomb attacks that would follow 5 months later. The estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 dead. Approximately 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. 1 million people were left homeless. The operational report filed after the mission recorded the results in the same tone used to record any other successful military operation. The language was technical. The measurements were precise. The assessment was positive. LeMay understood what he was doing. He said so in documented statements made both during and after the war. He acknowledged that if the United States lost the war, he would be tried as a war criminal. He won the war. He was awarded the Air Medal. He was eventually made Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. The question of whether what he ordered constituted a war crime was never formally examined by any tribunal with jurisdiction over American military conduct, because no such tribunal was ever convened, and the creation of any such tribunal would have required the United States to accept the principle that its own military conduct was subject to the same legal standards it was applying to German and Japanese commanders at Nuremberg and Tokyo. That principle was not accepted. It has not been accepted since. The documentation that would have supported a formal legal examination of Allied bombing campaigns was classified, managed, and in some cases destroyed. What survived is sufficient to reconstruct the general outline of what happened. The specific decision-making records, the internal debates about proportionality, the assessments of civilian casualties as an explicit operational goal rather than an unfortunate side effect, those remain partially available in archives, partially restricted, and partially absent in ways that suggest they were not simply misfiled. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki present a different but related institutional problem. The public record of the decision to use atomic weapons has been constructed and maintained with a care that reflects its political sensitivity. The official justification, which held that the atomic bombs were necessary to avoid a land invasion of Japan that would have cost enormous numbers of American and Japanese lives, was not simply the conclusion reached after an open examination of all available evidence. It was, to a significant degree, the conclusion that was decided upon first and then supported by the selective use of evidence. The casualty projections that were cited to justify the bomb, figures suggesting that an American invasion of Japan could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives, were not uniformly agreed upon by the military planners who would have been responsible for executing such an invasion. The actual planning documents from the summer of 1945, some of which were classified until decades after the war, show a range of estimates and a range of views about how a Japanese surrender might be achieved. Several senior American military commanders, including Admiral Leahy and General Eisenhower, expressed reservations about the bomb either during or immediately after the war. Those reservations were not prominent features of the official post-war record. The role of the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan, which occurred on August 8 between the two atomic bombings, was also managed carefully in the official record. Japanese government documents and post-war testimony from Japanese decision-makers indicate that the Soviet declaration of war was, for the Japanese government, at least as significant a shock as the atomic bombings. Japan had been hoping to use the Soviet Union as a potential intermediary for negotiated surrender. The Soviet entry into the war eliminated that option. Whether the atomic bombs were the decisive factor in Japanese surrender, or whether the combination of factors including the Soviet entry, the ongoing conventional bombing campaign, and the general collapse of Japanese strategic position would have produced surrender on a comparable timeline, is a question that the official American record has never engaged with in a fully open way, because the answer to that question has implications for the legal and moral status of the decision to use atomic weapons against civilian populations. The documentation of Japanese casualties from the atomic bombings was itself a subject of institutional control. American occupation authorities in Japan restricted reporting on the medical effects of radiation for years after the war. Japanese doctors who were treating atomic bomb survivors were prohibited from publishing their findings. The systematic study of radiation sickness, of the long-term health effects of exposure to atomic blast and fallout, was conducted under American institutional authority in ways that controlled how and when the findings were made public. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known in Japanese as hibakusha, were for years discouraged from speaking publicly about their experiences in ways that might create political difficulties for the occupation administration or for the broader American public narrative about the necessity and righteousness of the bomb. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was an institutional process. It involved the Army, the Occupation Administration, medical authorities, and the developing framework of American national security law. It was the routine operation of institutions managing information in ways that served institutional interests. The people who made these decisions were not, for the most part, motivated by personal malice. They were managing a situation according to the logic of their institutional position. That is exactly what makes it difficult to discuss, and exactly what was suppressed. The treatment of Soviet conduct during the war presents its own archival problem. The alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was one of the central political realities of the conflict, and the suppression of information about Soviet military conduct during the war was, for a significant period, an active policy of the Western Allied governments, because openly acknowledging what the Soviet Union was doing would have complicated the maintenance of the alliance that was essential to defeating Germany. The Katyn massacre is the most documented example of this suppression. In April and May of 1940, Soviet NKVD forces executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police officers, intellectuals, and other members of the Polish elite who had been captured following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939. The executions were carried out in several locations, the most well-known of which is the Katyn forest near Smolensk. Each victim was shot once in the back of the head. The bodies were buried in mass graves. The operation was authorized at the highest levels of the Soviet government, including by Stalin personally. The paperwork authorizing the executions was filed and retained in Soviet archives. When the mass graves were discovered by German forces in 1943, Germany announced the discovery and invited an international forensic investigation, partly for the genuine purpose of documenting what had happened, and partly for the propagandistic purpose of demonstrating Soviet brutality to occupied European populations. The Soviet Union denied responsibility and attributed the massacre to German forces. The British and American governments, faced with documentation that pointed clearly toward Soviet responsibility, chose to support the Soviet position publicly, or at minimum to avoid supporting the German position, because the alliance with the Soviet Union was considered more important than the accurate attribution of responsibility for the deaths of 22,000 Polish citizens. The American government conducted its own internal investigation. An officer named Owen O'Malley, who was serving as the British ambassador to the Polish government in exile, produced a formal report concluding that the Soviet Union was responsible for the Katyn massacre. That report was classified. It was not made available to the public or to the Polish government in exile that was nominally the British government's ally. American investigators reached similar conclusions and produced similar documentation. That documentation was also classified and specifically restricted from the Nuremberg Tribunal, which was being organized at the same time, because including evidence of Soviet responsibility for Katyn at Nuremberg would have required either prosecuting the Soviet Union alongside Germany, which was politically impossible, or openly acknowledging that the tribunal was applying standards to Germany that were not being applied to all parties. The Soviet Union continued to deny responsibility for Katyn for nearly 5 decades. In 1990, the Soviet government under Mikhail Gorbachev finally acknowledged Soviet responsibility. The full documentation of the massacre, including the authorization paperwork bearing Stalin's signature, was released from Russian archives in 1992. The British and American suppression of their own investigations into Katyn remained a matter of official sensitivity for years beyond that. The Katyn case is particularly instructive because it demonstrates how suppression worked at the level of formal institutional process. It was not rumor that was suppressed. It was documented investigative findings produced by credentialed government officials within their official function, that were classified and withheld from public and even from Allied diplomatic knowledge, because releasing them would have created political problems that the governments involved were not willing to manage. The decision to suppress was itself a documented decision, made in writing by identifiable individuals operating within the normal procedures of their respective governments. The suppression was bureaucratic. It was orderly. It was, within its own institutional framework, routine. The use of prisoners of war as forced labor by Allied powers during and after the war is another category of information that was managed carefully in the official record. The Geneva Convention of 1929 permitted the use of prisoner of war labor under specific conditions related to the nature of the work and the treatment of the prisoners. All major belligerents used prisoner of war labor during the conflict. The legal framework existed, and the legal framework was widely violated. The Soviet Union used German prisoners of war as forced labor on a massive scale, and for many years after the formal end of the war. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners died in Soviet captivity from conditions that included starvation, exposure, and the effects of compulsory labor in conditions that did not meet any reasonable interpretation of the Geneva Convention standards. The last German prisoners were not repatriated from the Soviet Union until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. The Soviet use of German prisoner labor was not a secret. It was an acknowledged policy. But the scale of mortality in Soviet prisoner of war camps and the systematic nature of the conditions that produced that mortality were topics that the Western Allied governments were not motivated to press publicly, because raising them would have complicated the emerging Cold War diplomatic relationship with the Soviet Union, and because a number of Western European governments were themselves not in a position to have their own prisoner of war practices examined too closely. France used German prisoners of war as forced labor for years after the war ended. German prisoners worked in French mines and on French farms under conditions that produced significant mortality, particularly in the immediate post-war period when supply chains were disrupted and French administrators were not under any significant institutional pressure to prioritize the welfare of German prisoners. The British also retained German prisoners as labor for years after formal hostilities ended. The rationalization used by the British government was that the labor was provided as a form of reparation, and that the legal framework could be stretched to accommodate this interpretation. Independent assessments of the conditions in which British-held German prisoners worked do not uniformly support the conclusion that the conditions met the standards that the same British government was publicly endorsing. The American record is also not without its complications. The treatment of German prisoners in American custody immediately after the war, in the period of improvised camps established to hold the millions of German soldiers who surrendered in the final weeks of the European war, has been a subject of significant historical dispute. The scale of the surrender created genuine logistical problems. The number of prisoners exceeded what any advance planning had anticipated. The infrastructure for housing, feeding, and administering millions of prisoners was not in place. Prisoners were held in open fields surrounded by wire, exposed to weather, with inadequate food and water. The mortality figures for German prisoners in American custody in this period have been disputed. Historians have argued significantly about the numbers, and the available documentation does not provide a fully clean answer, partly because record-keeping in the chaos of the final weeks of the war was inconsistent, partly because the categorization of prisoners changed during this period in ways that affected their legal status, and therefore the documentation of their treatment, and partly because the American government was not, in this period, producing documentation that it anticipated would be reviewed critically. What is not in dispute is that the conditions in which many German prisoners were held in the spring and summer of 1945 did not conform to the standards that the United States was publicly committed to enforcing. The administrative decisions that produced those conditions were made by identifiable people within the institutional framework of the American military. Some of those decisions were made deliberately, in the sense that they reflected choices about resource allocation and administrative priority. The documentation of those decisions was not the subject of any formal post-war accountability process. The collaboration of European civilian populations and institutions with Nazi occupation is a category of historical fact that was suppressed not primarily by the Allied governments, but by the governments and societies of occupied Europe themselves, and that suppression operated through some of the same mechanisms. The post-war narrative of occupied France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and other occupied Western European countries emphasized resistance and suffering and minimized collaboration and accommodation. This was not simply an error of memory. It was an institutional process. Governments that needed to function, that needed to maintain administrative continuity, that needed to manage populations who had spent years living under occupation and making the accommodations that life under occupation required, had strong institutional reasons to endorse a narrative that emphasized the exceptional nature of collaboration and the representative nature of resistance. The French case is the most extensively documented. The Vichy government, which administered unoccupied France and collaborated with German occupation authorities in northern France from 1940 to 1944, was not a German-imposed administration. It was a French government composed of French politicians, French bureaucrats, French military officers, and French police, operating under French law, making decisions that reflected French institutional interests as understood by the people making them. The Vichy government passed anti-Semitic legislation before being required to do so by Germany. The French police participated in the deportation of French Jews, including French-born Jewish citizens who had no direct connection to Germany, to German extermination camps. The administrative records of these operations were French administrative records, produced by French civil servants following French bureaucratic procedures. The post-war French narrative about Vichy required the suppression of significant amounts of this documentation and the active promotion of an alternative account in which Vichy was a kind of imposed anomaly, a parenthesis in French history rather than a chapter of it. Charles de Gaulle's formulation of a France that had been essentially resistant, in which the Vichy collaborators were a small and unrepresentative minority, served essential political functions. It allowed the reconstitution of French national identity. It allowed former Vichy officials and collaborators to be reintegrated into post-war French institutions, which was a practical necessity, given that French institutions continued to require people with administrative experience, and many of the people with the most administrative experience had acquired it working for Vichy. The legal processes through which France dealt with collaboration were deliberately limited in scope. The epuration, the post-war purge of collaborators, prosecuted some individuals and exempted many others according to criteria that reflected political necessity as much as they reflected the actual record of wartime conduct. Trials that might have examined institutional collaboration, the participation of police forces, the functioning of courts, the conduct of civil servants, were avoided because they would have implicated too many people who were still functioning within institutions that needed to remain operational. The documents that would have supported broader accountability were classified, lost, or managed in ways that made them unavailable for use in accountability processes. The French archives on Vichy were not fully open to researchers until decades after the war. Specific categories of documentation remained restricted for reasons that reflected the sensitivity of what they contained about individuals and institutions that remained part of French public life long after the war ended. The academic reckoning with what the Vichy government actually was and what it actually did began in earnest in the 1970s and 1980s, and it encountered institutional resistance that reflected the ongoing presence within French academic and political culture of people who had personal or institutional stakes in the older narrative. The pharmaceutical and medical experimentation conducted by German doctors and researchers in the concentration camp system is extensively documented and extensively known, at least in its general outlines. What is less well known, and what was specifically managed in the post-war period, is the degree to which the results of that experimentation were used by Allied governments and their scientific establishments after the war. The experiments conducted at Dachau on the effects of hypothermia on human subjects were the work of Sigmund Rascher, who exposed prisoners to freezing temperatures in water tanks and recorded their deaths with methodical precision. The data produced by those experiments was, by any reasonable ethical standard, produced through criminal means. It recorded the deaths of individuals who were murdered for the purpose of producing it. That data was also, from a purely physiological standpoint, data about what happens to the human body under specific temperature conditions, and it was data that did not exist in any form produced through ethical means. American military and scientific authorities faced a formal question about this data after the war. The question was whether it was permissible to use data produced through criminal experimentation. The answer that was arrived at, through a process that was itself not fully transparent, was essentially that the data could be used with appropriate notation of its provenance, because excluding it would not undo the harm that had been done to produce it and would sacrifice information that might be of medical value. That determination was made by identifiable institutional actors operating within formal institutional processes. The documentation of how that determination was reached was not widely circulated. The use of data produced through the murder of concentration camp prisoners became a policy reality that was managed through institutional procedure rather than subjected to open public examination. The transfer of German scientists and technical experts to the United States under Operation Paperclip is one of the most extensively suppressed categories of post-war information, not because the basic fact of the program was unknown, but because the full scope of the backgrounds of the individuals transferred, the deliberate alteration of their records to obscure their involvement with the Nazi Party and with war crimes, and the institutional decisions that authorized those alterations were classified for decades. The program eventually transferred over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States. It ran from 1945 until 1959. It was authorized at the highest levels of the American government and was supported by the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the newly created CIA, and eventually NASA. The scientists who were transferred included individuals who had been members of the SS. They included individuals who had used slave labor from concentration camps in their research facilities. They included individuals whose wartime activities, if examined according to the standards being applied at Nuremberg, would have resulted in prosecution. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered Operation Paperclip, was specifically directed by military leadership to recruit scientists whose expertise made them valuable regardless of their political and criminal backgrounds, and was further directed to ensure that the security screening process did not produce findings that would prevent the recruitment of those individuals. This was not an improvised decision made in the chaos of the immediate post-war period. It was a deliberate institutional policy, authorized in writing, implemented through formal procedures, and sustained over a period of years. The people responsible for implementing it understood what they were doing. The records documenting their understanding were classified. When those records eventually became available through Declassification and Freedom of Information Act requests over the following decades, what they revealed was an institutional culture in which the management of uncomfortable information was itself a technical skill, something that required careful procedural attention and produced its own documentation, which then also required management. Werner von Braun is the most prominent individual associated with Operation Paperclip, and his case illustrates the pattern most clearly. Von Braun was the technical director of the V2 rocket program at Peenemünde, and later at the underground Mittelwerk facility in the Harz Mountains. The V2 rockets were produced using forced labor from the Dora concentration camp. The conditions at Mittelwerk were such that more people died producing the V2 than were killed by V2 attacks. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk. He was aware of the conditions. He applied for and received SS membership. These facts were known to American authorities who transferred him. His personnel file was altered. His SS membership was omitted or reclassified. He was transferred to the United States, eventually naturalized as an American citizen, and became the technical director of the American rocket program that produced the Saturn V and put American astronauts on the moon. He was celebrated. He was awarded the National Medal of Science. His obituaries in American newspapers described him as one of the great figures of American technological achievement. The decision to manage his background in the way that it was managed was an institutional decision. It was made by people who had access to his actual record and who decided, for reasons they recorded in documents that were then classified, that his technical value to American strategic interests outweighed the complications that his actual wartime record would create if it were publicly known. The people who made that decision were not doing anything that was inconsistent with the institutional culture in which they operated. They were weighing competing interests and arriving at conclusions that served the interests of the institution they served. The moral dimension of those conclusions was a factor that was considered and then subordinated to other factors. That is how institutional decisions are made. The Japanese Unit 731 presents the most dramatic case of post-war suppression of wartime criminal conduct in exchange for technical intelligence. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated primarily in occupied Manchuria from 1935 until the end of the war. The unit conducted experiments on human subjects that included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhus, and other diseases, vivisection without anesthesia, exposure to extreme cold, extreme heat, and atmospheric decompression, and the testing of biological and chemical weapons on living prisoners. The prisoners used were primarily Chinese, Korean, and Soviet, and included civilians as well as prisoners of war. The number of people killed in Unit 731 experiments is estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 12,000, with some estimates higher. The American decision to grant immunity to the leaders of Unit 731 in exchange for the data produced by their experiments was made through a process that was classified for decades and that was specifically structured to prevent the information from reaching the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal that was convened to address Japanese war crimes. General Douglas MacArthur, as Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in Japan, was a central figure in this process. His headquarters negotiated directly with former Unit 731 personnel, received the experimental data and the technical findings in exchange for immunity from prosecution, and ensured that the information about those negotiations and about the nature of the data being exchanged was not made available to the tribunal. The rationale was explicitly stated in the internal documentation. The United States government determined that the biological warfare data produced by Unit 731 was of sufficient military and scientific value that granting immunity to the individuals who had produced it was an acceptable exchange. The alternative, prosecution of those individuals at Tokyo, would have required revealing what they had done, and would then have created public and political pressure to account for the disposition of the data they had produced. Managing the situation through classified immunity agreements avoided that problem. The Unit 731 researchers returned to post-war Japanese civilian life. Several of them had distinguished post-war careers in Japanese medicine, academia, and industry. Shiro Ishii, the commander of Unit 731, died in 1959 in Japan of throat cancer, having lived his entire post-war life without facing any formal accountability for the deaths of the thousands of people who were killed in his research program. The documentation of the American decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 personnel was classified. It became available gradually through declassification processes beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 1990s and beyond. Each successive release of documentation revealed additional dimensions of an institutional process that had been operating with considerable sophistication to manage information that the people managing it understood to be deeply sensitive. The sophistication of the management process is itself a form of evidence about how well those institutions understood what they were managing. The sexual violence committed during World War II was suppressed so completely and for so long that the mechanisms of that suppression became normalized as simply the way such things are not discussed. The rape of Nanjing in 1937 and 1938, which preceded American involvement in the war but is inseparable from the broader context of the Pacific conflict, involved the murder of between 40,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and the rape of an estimated 20,000 to 80,000 Chinese women by Japanese forces over a period of approximately 6 weeks. The range of estimates is itself a product of the politics of documentation. Japanese sources have historically produced lower figures. Chinese sources and most independent historical assessments have produced higher ones. The Japanese government's official relationship to this event has been characterized, at various points in post-war history, by denial, by minimization, by partial acknowledgement, and by ongoing political contestation, because the full acknowledgement of what happened at Nanjing carries implications for Japanese institutional and political culture that those institutions have not been willing to fully absorb. The systematic sexual enslavement of women in occupied Asia by the Japanese military was a program of institutional scale and duration. The women who were forced into this system, referred to as comfort, women using a term that is itself a product of the institutional management of language in a way that made what was happening easier to administer and to discuss without confronting its reality, came primarily from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories. The recruitment process often involved deception or direct coercion. The conditions in the comfort stations varied, but were generally characterized by the absence of any meaningful ability to refuse. The scale of the program was large, with estimates of the total number of women involved ranging from tens of thousands to over 200,000. The post-war treatment of the comfort women system in the official record was shaped by the same dynamic that shaped the treatment of Unit 731. The Allied occupation authorities in Japan did not press for prosecution of the individuals responsible for administering the comfort women system, partly because the documentation was scattered and difficult to assemble, partly because Japanese authorities were not cooperative in providing it, and partly because the occupation administration had other priorities and the political will to press this particular accountability was not strong. Japan's post-war government denied for many years that the comfort women system had been a program of state-organized sexual slavery, characterizing it instead as a commercial arrangement in which the women involved had participated voluntarily. That characterization required the suppression of available documentation, including Japanese military documents that recorded the operation of comfort stations as a formal military administrative function. The German military's conduct on the Eastern Front, which involved the deaths of an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens from all causes, produced a volume of documentation that was handled in two distinct ways. Within the Soviet Union, the full scope of what had happened was simultaneously a subject of intense official commemoration and significant official control. Stalin's post-war Soviet Union used the memory of what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War as a foundational element of national and ideological legitimacy, but it used that memory selectively in ways that emphasized Soviet heroism and suffering while suppressing specific information about Soviet military conduct, Soviet administrative decisions that contributed to civilian casualties, and the treatment of Soviet soldiers who had been captured, escaped, or otherwise fallen outside the normal framework of military service in ways that the Soviet system treated as evidence of disloyalty. Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans and who survived German prisoner-of-war camps were not treated as victims upon their return to the Soviet Union. They were treated as suspect. Stalin had issued an order in 1941 that defined surrender as treason, and that made the families of soldiers who were captured subject to state sanctions. Soldiers who returned from German captivity were screened by NKVD counterintelligence, held in filtration camps, and a significant proportion were sentenced to labor camps, executed, or subjected to other forms of state punishment for the act of having been captured. The individuals who administered these screenings were following procedures. The procedures were documented. The documentation was classified and remained classified until the Soviet archive system began to open after 1991. The full scope of what happened to returning Soviet prisoners of war was not part of the Soviet public memory of the war, because including it would have complicated the institutional narrative of the war in ways that the Soviet state was not willing to manage. The German institutional record of the Eastern Front presents its own specific suppression problem. The Vernichtungskrieg, The war of annihilation that Germany conducted in the Soviet Union was documented in considerable detail by German military and administrative authorities. The documentation existed at every level of the German command structure. Orders for the treatment of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war that explicitly departed from the standards of the Hague and Geneva Conventions were issued in writing, transmitted through normal military communication channels, and acknowledged in writing by the units that received them. The Commissar Order, which directed German forces to execute captured Soviet political officers, was a formal, written directive issued through normal military administrative channels. The documentation of its implementation, the reports filed by units recording their compliance with the directive, exists in archives that were captured by Allied forces after the war. Not all of that documentation was used at Nuremberg. The decision about what documentation to present at Nuremberg was an institutional decision made by the people organizing and prosecuting the trials, and it reflected a range of considerations, including what was necessary to prove the specific charges being brought, what was legally admissible under the procedures being applied, and what would produce the clearest and most manageable narrative in a proceeding that was unprecedented in its scope and structure, and that needed to function as a legal process while also serving as a historical record and a political event. The documentation that was not presented at Nuremberg did not disappear. It went into archives. The accessibility of those archives has varied over the decades since the war, and the process of historical reconstruction from those archives has been ongoing, producing revisions to the historical record that continue to the present. The role of international financial and industrial institutions in sustaining the German war economy is a category of information that was suppressed with particular thoroughness, because the institutions involved were not German institutions. They were Swiss banks. They were American corporations. They were British firms. They were international banking relationships that predated the war and that continued to function through various mechanisms during the war, because the people running those institutions were making decisions according to the logic of their institutional function, which was to manage financial flows and commercial relationships in ways that produced institutional benefit, and the war did not automatically override that logic. The Bank for International Settlements, which was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to manage German reparations payments from the First World War, continued to operate throughout the Second World War. It had representatives from the central banks of both Allied and Axis nations on its board. It processed financial transactions that involved gold looted by Germany from occupied countries and from the victims of the Holocaust. The Swiss National Bank purchased looted gold from Germany, including gold that had been taken from victims of the extermination camps and processed through German industrial facilities, with the gold from dental work melted down and recast into standard bars. The documentation of these transactions was in Swiss banking records. Swiss banking secrecy, which was a formal legal framework rather than simply a cultural preference, protected those records from examination for decades. American corporate involvement in the German war economy was documented sufficiently to create serious post-war legal and political problems for several major companies, and those problems were managed in ways that reflected the political and economic power of the companies involved. International business machines, the Ford Motor Company, and General Motors had significant pre-war investments in German subsidiary companies that continued to produce goods for the German military during the war. The profits from those operations accrued in Germany, and in some cases the companies sought and received post-war compensation from the American government for damage done to their German facilities by Allied bombing. The documentation supporting these compensation claims required the companies to formally acknowledge the existence and the wartime operation of their German subsidiaries. The broader implications of that documentation for questions about the company's wartime conduct were not pursued through any formal accountability process. The suppression of this information was not primarily a government operation. It was a function of the financial and legal resources available to large corporations, their ability to manage the documentary record of their own operations, and the political relationships that made formal government investigation of their wartime conduct a low priority. The people making these management decisions within corporate institutions were doing what people in those positions routinely do, which is to manage information in ways that protect the institution. The scale and the context of what they were managing was exceptional. The methodology was ordinary. The post-war fate of SS personnel and concentration camp administrators who evaded justice illustrates how institutional suppression extended into the post-war period through mechanisms that were themselves bureaucratic. The organized networks that assisted the escape of war criminals from Europe after the war, known as ratlines, were not purely improvised criminal enterprises. They operated with the knowledge and, in some cases, the active assistance of elements of the Catholic Church, specifically certain clerics who were motivated by anti-communism and who made judgments about the relative priority of different categories of moral concern. They operated with the knowledge and, in some cases, the active assistance of American and British intelligence services, which were in the process of transitioning from wartime operations to Cold War operations, and which found, in some cases, that individuals with specific skills and specific knowledge were more valuable as recruited assets than as defendants in war crimes proceedings. The documentation of American intelligence involvement in assisting the escape of war criminals was classified. Elements of it have become available through declassification, and those elements confirm the general outline of what the oral history and the investigative journalism had previously suggested. The CIA's operational relationship with Klaus Barbie, the head of the Gestapo in Lyon, who was responsible for the torture and deportation of thousands of French Jews and resistance members, is documented in records that were released in the 1980s following a formal American government inquiry. Barbie had been recruited by American Army Counterintelligence Corps after the war, had been used as an intelligence asset, and when French investigators began closing in on him, had been assisted in escaping to South America through a rat line that involved American intelligence cooperation. He lived in Bolivia under an assumed identity for decades. He was not extradited to France until 1983. He was tried, convicted, and died in prison in 1991. The American government issued a formal apology to France for its role in facilitating his escape. The apology acknowledged institutional responsibility without identifying or holding accountable the specific individuals within the institutional chain who had made the decisions that the apology acknowledged. That is the pattern. Institutional acknowledgement without individual accountability. The form of accountability without its substance. The documentation exists. The decisions are recorded. The names are in the files. The institutional process that produced those decisions operated normally within its own framework, according to its own logic. The accountability process, when it eventually comes, operates at the level of the institution, acknowledges that things happened, expresses regret in official language, and then moves to close the matter without examining the procedural machinery that produced it, because that machinery is still running. The bombing of neutral countries during World War II is not well remembered, partly because the term neutral presents certain documentary complications for the governments responsible. Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain maintained formal neutrality throughout the war, and all three suffered American or British bombing attacks, most of which were officially attributed to navigation error, to equipment malfunction, or to the general difficulty of maintaining accurate targeting under combat conditions. Some of those attributions were accurate, some of them were not. American B-17s bombed the Swiss city of Schaffhausen in April 1944, killing approximately 40 people and injuring hundreds more. The American government acknowledged the attack, attributed it to navigational error, and paid compensation to Switzerland. The internal documentation about the attack, including the question of whether the navigational error was the complete explanation for why a formation of American bombers was over Swiss territory, was not part of the public record. Switzerland's geographic position, surrounded by German-controlled territory, created conditions in which the boundaries between Germany and Switzerland were not always easy to maintain in the context of air operations, and the operational incentives created by those conditions were not always aligned with the formal requirement to respect Swiss neutrality. The deliberate use of napalm as a weapon against civilian populations in the Pacific Theater was not fully acknowledged in American public communications during the war, and the specific mechanics of how napalm incendiary attacks affected human beings were not part of the information that American wartime authorities made available to American civilian audiences. Napalm had been developed at Harvard University beginning in 1942. It was a thickened petroleum product that adhered to surfaces and burned at extremely high temperatures. When it adhered to human skin, it could not be removed by conventional means and continued to burn. The effects on human bodies of napalm fires, effects that American pilots and bombardiers were producing on Japanese civilian populations throughout the Pacific Campaign, were documented in operational reports that were classified. The Japanese medical records of casualties from incendiary attacks were suppressed by American occupation authorities after the war for the same general reasons that medical records of atomic bomb casualties were suppressed, which is that their public availability would have created difficulties for the management of the official narrative about the conduct and necessity of the Pacific Air Campaign. The German Army's formal institutional relationship to the Holocaust, which the post-war German military establishment managed through a narrative that attributed the principal responsibility for the Holocaust to the SS and to Nazi party structures rather than to the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, was a form of suppression that was sustained through institutional channels for decades after the war. The clean Wehrmacht myth held that the regular German military had fought a conventional war within the normal bounds of military conduct and had not been responsible for the systematic murder of Jews and others that had been carried out by the SS and the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units. The documentary record does not support this narrative. Wehrmacht units participated directly in mass shootings of Jews and Soviet civilians in the occupied Soviet Union from the earliest days of the invasion. Wehrmacht commanders issued orders directing their units to cooperate with Einsatzgruppen operations. Wehrmacht administrative authorities were responsible for the conditions in prisoner-of-war camps in the Soviet Union, where Soviet soldiers died by the millions from starvation, exposure, and disease in circumstances that reflected deliberate policy decisions about resource allocation. Wehrmacht supply and logistical systems supported the transportation of Jews to extermination camps. The documentation of all of this exists in captured German military records, in the records of the Nuremberg Tribunal, and in the records of subsequent German war crimes trials. The clean Wehrmacht myth was nevertheless sufficiently powerful and sufficiently institutionally supported that it persisted as the dominant German public understanding of the war for decades. It was supported by the memoirs of German generals who were published in the post-war period and who had institutional incentives to construct narratives that separated their own conduct from the conduct of the Nazi political and SS apparatus. It was supported by a West German government that needed to build a new national narrative and that found the clean Wehrmacht myth useful for constructing a post-war military identity that could support German rearmament within the NATO framework. It was supported by American and British strategic interests that were developing a German alliance against the Soviet Union, and that found it easier to work with former Wehrmacht officers if those officers were understood to have been professional soldiers rather than participants in genocidal violence. The formal historical reckoning with Wehrmacht participation in the Holocaust in Germany began with the Crimes of the Wehrmacht exhibition, which opened in Hamburg in 1995 and traveled to various German cities. The exhibition documented Wehrmacht participation in mass killings through photographs, documents, and testimony. It was controversial in the specific sense that it encountered significant institutional resistance from elements of German society that had personal and familial connections to the narrative. It was challenging. The controversy was itself evidence of how effectively the institutional suppression of this information had operated for 50 years. The treatment of Holocaust survivors immediately after the war is a category of information that is not frequently included in the standard historical account of liberation. The liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces produced documentation, photographs, and testimony that was used immediately for its political and historical value as evidence of German atrocity. What happened to the survivors themselves after liberation was managed through institutional processes that reflected the priorities and limitations of the military and governmental authorities responsible for them. Survivors who had been liberated from concentration camps were, in many cases, held in the same camps for extended periods after liberation because there was nowhere else to put them, and because the administrative resources to process their situation were not immediately available. They were sometimes given inadequate food and medical care in the initial period after liberation because the logistical priorities of the Allied military were focused on the active prosecution of the war, and the welfare of concentration camp survivors was a secondary priority within the institutional framework that was managing the overall situation. The documentation of what happened to survivors in the period immediately following liberation reflects the gap between the political use of their situation and the material management of their actual condition. The question of what would happen to Jewish survivors after the war, where they would go, what their status would be, what obligations the Allied powers and the international community had toward them, was a political question that the Allied governments were not willing to engage with openly, because the answers to those questions involved immigration policy, the political situation in Mandatory Palestine, the interests of Arab governments with whom the British were managing complex relationships, and the domestic political considerations of governments that were not, in their internal discussions, uniformly enthusiastic about significant increases in Jewish immigration. The documentation of internal Allied government discussions about the post-war fate of Jewish survivors reveals attitudes and priorities that were not consistent with the public posture those governments adopted in relation to the revelation of Nazi atrocities. President Roosevelt's administration had information about the systematic murder of European Jews from multiple sources beginning in 1942. The decision about what to do with that information, how to respond to it, whether to make it the subject of public communication, whether to take specific military or diplomatic actions that might have reduced the pace of the killing, involved institutional deliberations that were documented and that remained classified for many years. The War Refugee Board, which was eventually established in January 1944 to take direct action on behalf of threatened Jewish populations in Europe, was established against the institutional resistance of the State Department, which had been managing the flow of information about the Holocaust in ways that reflected the department's bureaucratic and diplomatic priorities rather than the urgency of what the information described. The State Department had actively suppressed a cable from the American consul in Geneva in 1942 that contained detailed information about the systematic murder of Jews in German-occupied Europe. The suppression of that cable was documented in a report produced by the Treasury Department, which had become involved in the refugee question through its control of financial resources that might be used for rescue operations. The Treasury Department report, prepared by a junior official named Josiah Dubois, and eventually seen by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, described the State Department's behavior in language that characterized it as deliberate obstruction of efforts to rescue Jews from Europe. That report was produced within the normal framework of interdepartmental communication. Its contents were explosive in their implications. Its existence was not public. Morgenthau brought it to Roosevelt personally, and the War Refugee Board was established in its aftermath. The institutional history of what the American government knew about the Holocaust, when it knew it, and what decisions were made about how to respond to that knowledge, is a subject that was managed carefully in the post-war period because it involved senior officials of the Roosevelt administration, which was the administration that had led the United States to victory in the war, and which occupied a position of historical celebration that created institutional incentives to avoid examinations that might complicate that celebration. The nuclear weapons program of the United States, which produced the bombs that were used against Japan, generated a classification framework that remained in effect for decades, and that shaped what was publicly known about the program, about the decision-making processes that led to the use of the bombs, and about the effects of the bombs on their targets. The decision not to demonstrate the bomb to Japan before using it against a populated city was debated internally before the Hiroshima attack. Scientists working on the Manhattan Project produced a petition, organized by Leo Szilard, that was signed by 70 scientists, and that argued against the use of the bomb against populated Japanese cities without a prior demonstration of its effects. That petition was classified. It did not reach President Truman before the decision to use the bomb was implemented. The classification of the petition was itself a decision made within the institutional framework of the Manhattan Project's security apparatus. Whether the classification was specifically intended to prevent the petition from reaching decision-makers, or whether it was simply the routine operation of a security system that classified everything, is a question that the available documentation does not answer with complete clarity. The radiation effects data produced by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was collected systematically by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission that began operating in Japan in 1947, was the subject of a specific policy decision that determined that the data would be collected and analyzed, but not used for the direct medical benefit of atomic bomb survivors. The Commission's mandate was to study the effects of radiation on human beings, not to treat the people being studied. Japanese survivors of the atomic bombings were subjected to medical examinations and data collection by American researchers operating in an occupied country, and the data produced by those examinations was classified and made available only to American military and scientific authorities rather than to the Japanese medical community that was treating the survivors or to the survivors themselves. This policy was documented. It reflected the institutional determination that the data had military and scientific value that needed to be controlled, and that the treatment of the people from whom the data was taken was a separate and secondary consideration. The post-war economic and industrial recovery of West Germany was managed through the Marshall Plan and through a set of institutional decisions about how German industry and German industrial capacity would be reintegrated into the Western European and Atlantic economic system. That recovery was in some respects remarkably rapid, and one of the institutional mechanisms that contributed to its rapidity was a set of decisions about the continuity of German industrial management. The large German industrial firms, the chemical companies, the steel companies, the automotive manufacturers that had been integral to the German war economy and to the use of slave labor in that economy, were, after a period of denazification that varied significantly in its thoroughness and its results, permitted to reconstitute themselves and to continue operating. The denazification process, which was intended to remove from positions of authority in German public and institutional life the individuals who had been responsible for supporting and implementing Nazi policies, operated differently in different zones of occupation and with varying degrees of institutional commitment. In the American zone, the process was extensive in its initial scope, but progressively less rigorous as the strategic imperatives of the emerging Cold War shifted the priorities of American occupation authorities. German industrial and administrative expertise was needed for the reconstruction of West Germany as a stable Western ally, and the denazification process was managed in ways that allowed individuals whose wartime records were complicated to be reintegrated into institutional roles where their expertise could be applied. The individuals who had managed the use of slave labor in German industrial facilities, who had signed the contracts with the SS for the rental of concentration camp prisoners, who had made the logistical and administrative decisions that determined the conditions under which that labor was used, were not uniformly held to account in ways that corresponded to what the documentation of their conduct would have supported. The documentation existed. The American occupation authorities had access to it. The decisions about how to use it in accountability processes reflected the institutional priorities of an occupation authority that was increasingly focused on stabilizing and rebuilding Germany rather than on the thoroughness of accountability for wartime conduct. The IG Farben trial at Nuremberg prosecuted 24 executives of the massive German chemical conglomerate, which had been the largest chemical company in the world before the war, and which had been directly involved in the production of Zyklon B, the pesticide that was used as the killing agent in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, as well as in the operation of a synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz III, which used slave labor from the Auschwitz concentration camp complex. The sentences handed down at the IG Farben trial were widely characterized, including by American prosecutors at Nuremberg, as grossly inadequate for the conduct that had been documented. The longest sentence was 8 years, and none of the convicted executives served their full sentences. Upon their release, several returned to positions of prominence in German and international business. The inadequacy of the sentences reflected partly the evidentiary standards being applied, partly the legal framework within which the tribunal was operating, and partly the changing institutional context of the late 1940s, in which the Cold War was redefining the relationship between the Western occupying powers and West Germany, and in which the practical utility of German industrial reconstruction was being given institutional priority. The people making these decisions were making them according to the logic of their institutional position. The moral dimension was not absent from their deliberations. It was subordinated. The firebombings of Japanese cities other than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed more people than the atomic bombs and destroyed more urban area, are less well remembered than the atomic bombings, partly because they fit less neatly into the narrative framework that the atomic bombings subsequently generated. The firebombing of 67 Japanese cities during the spring and summer of 1945 was an industrial process. The B-29s flew from bases in the Mariana Islands. The missions were planned by staff officers using standard operational procedures. The targeting priorities were established through an analytical process that identified which types of urban areas produced the most efficient results, meaning the highest ratio of destruction to ordnance expended. The results were evaluated using standard damage assessment procedures. The entire operation was documented in operational records that were filed according to standard military administrative procedures. The people who planned and executed those missions were doing their institutional jobs. The pilots who flew the missions were following their orders and executing their training. The ground crews who loaded the incendiary bombs were performing their assigned tasks. The administrative staff who processed the operational records were meeting their documentation requirements. The scale of what was being organized and executed through this normal institutional process, the destruction of 67 cities, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, was not inconsistent with the orderly functioning of the institutions doing it. That is the aspect of the Pacific Air Campaign that is most difficult to accommodate within conventional frameworks for understanding what constitutes atrocity, because atrocity is typically associated with disorder, with loss of institutional control, with the breakdown of normal procedure. What the Pacific Air Campaign demonstrated is that normal procedure, efficiently executed, is capable of producing outcomes that equal or exceed in their human cost anything that disorder produces. The medical and scientific experiments conducted by German and Japanese military and paramilitary agencies during the war produced data that was absorbed into the post-war scientific and medical establishment in ways that were not uniformly acknowledged. The debate within the scientific and medical community about whether data produced through criminal means can or should be used is one that continued for decades after the war and that has not been fully resolved. The American medical literature of the post-war decades contains references to data that was produced through the criminal experimentation of the Nazi medical program without always fully accounting for the provenance of that data or for the conditions under which it was produced. This was not a widespread conspiracy. It was the result of a scientific culture that processed data according to its scientific properties and was imperfectly attentive to its ethical history, and an institutional environment that had not established clear and enforced standards for the use of tainted data. The Nuremberg Code, which was produced as a direct response to the Nazi medical experiments documented at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, established principles for the ethical conduct of research involving human subjects that included the requirement for voluntary informed consent. The Nuremberg Code was adopted in 1947. American government research programs in the years immediately following its adoption conducted experiments on human subjects, including prisoners and mentally ill patients, without obtaining informed consent, in some cases using radioactive materials, and in some cases using biological agents. The people administering these research programs were aware of the Nuremberg Code. The relationship between the code's requirements and the actual conduct of American research programs was managed institutionally rather than enforced rigorously, and the documentation of those programs was classified. The role of the Vatican in World War II is a subject on which the historical record remains partially inaccessible because Vatican archives covering the papacy of Pius X, who led the Catholic Church from 1939 to 1958, were not fully open to researchers until 2020, and the systematic processing of those archives by historians is still ongoing. What is available from other sources, from German diplomatic records, from the testimonies of Holocaust survivors, from the correspondence of contemporaries, suggests that the Vatican's response to the Holocaust was shaped by institutional considerations that included the Church's relationship with the German government, its concerns about the fate of Catholics in territories controlled by both Germany and the Soviet Union, and its institutional judgment about what forms of action were likely to be effective and what forms were likely to create risks for the institution. Pope Pius X did not issue a formal public condemnation of the Holocaust. He was aware of the deportations. He was aware of the extermination camps. He received detailed reports from sources including the German military chaplains who were present in the East. The institutional decision about how to respond to that knowledge was made through the normal deliberative processes of the Vatican, and the conclusion of those deliberations was that public condemnation was likely to produce worse outcomes than the diplomacy and quiet intervention that the Vatican was already engaged in. Whether that conclusion was correct is one of the more difficult historical and moral questions that the available evidence supports, and it is one that has not been resolved even as the archival basis for examining it has expanded. The post-war treatment of concentration camp perpetrators who were not captured or prosecuted in the immediate post-war period reflects the functioning of several institutions simultaneously. The legal frameworks that governed the prosecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity had significant jurisdictional limitations. The practical capacity of post-war governments to locate, extradite, try, and imprison large numbers of individuals was constrained by resources, by political relationships, and by the passage of time. The documentation required to support successful prosecutions was scattered, destroyed, or inaccessible, and the institutional will to pursue prosecutions declined over time as the post-war period moved further from the war and as the Cold War shifted the political priorities of the governments that would have been responsible for conducting them. Adolf Eichmann, who had been the SS officer responsible for the logistical coordination of the deportation of Jews to extermination camps across occupied Europe, lived in Argentina under an assumed identity for 15 years after the war. He was identified, located, and abducted by Israeli intelligence operatives in 1960 and transported to Israel for trial. His trial in Jerusalem in 1961 was the occasion for one of the most influential analyses of how ordinary institutional behavior can sustain and enable mass atrocity. Hannah Arendt's account of the trial, which produced the concept of the banality of evil, was controversial, partly because it was perceived as mitigating Eichmann's individual responsibility by emphasizing the degree to which his conduct was that of an efficient bureaucrat rather than a personally motivated murderer. Eichmann was nevertheless convicted and executed in 1962. The West German government's relationship to former Nazi officials in its own administrative structure is a subject that is well documented, but not often foregrounded in the general understanding of post-war German history. The West German Foreign Ministry retained in the post-war period a significant number of individuals who had held positions in the Nazi-era foreign ministry, including individuals who had been involved in the diplomatic facilitation of deportation operations. An internal inquiry commissioned by the German Foreign Ministry and completed in 2005 documented the extent to which former Nazi Party members had been present in the post-war ministry and had actively worked to obstruct post-war accountability processes, including by using their positions to assist former colleagues in avoiding prosecution. The inquiry's findings were not publicly released by the Foreign Ministry until 2010. The German Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, retained after its establishment in 1956 a number of former SS and Gestapo officers whose operational experience and existing networks were considered valuable in the Cold War intelligence context. The BND was established under the direction of Reinhard Gehlen, a former German army intelligence officer who had run the intelligence apparatus on the Eastern Front and who transferred his networks and his files to American intelligence authorities immediately after the war in exchange for protection from prosecution and eventual establishment of his own intelligence organization. The Gehlen Organization, as it was initially known, operated under American oversight from 1946 until it was transferred to West German governmental authority in 1956. The extent to which former SS officers were incorporated into this structure was documented in American intelligence files that were classified for decades. The post-war intelligence community's use of individuals with Nazi backgrounds was not limited to Germany. The British intelligence community, the French intelligence community, and various allied intelligence services all made decisions in the early Cold War period that involved weighing the counterintelligence value of individuals against their wartime histories. Those decisions were made through institutional processes that were documented and classified. The classification protected the institutions making the decisions from accountability for them, and in many cases the classification outlasted the careers and in some cases the lives of the individuals whose decisions the documents recorded. The systematic nature of wartime propaganda in all major belligerent countries involved the production of official information that was understood at the time of its production to be significantly distorted. Governments at war produce propaganda. This is not a suppressed fact. What is less acknowledged is that the institutions responsible for producing propaganda did not uniformly cease operation after the war, and that the personnel and methodologies developed for wartime propaganda were transferred into post-war institutional contexts where they continued to function in relation to the management of the historical record of the war itself. The management of the war's public memory was not simply organic. It was, in many cases, an institutional process conducted by people who had professional expertise in the institutional management of public understanding. The British government's relationship to the management of information about the war's conduct, including the conduct of the strategic bombing campaign, was sustained through a classification system that kept specific documents restricted for periods extending well beyond the normal archival release schedules. Documents that were technically subject to the 30-year rule were in some cases kept restricted for 50 or 60 years. The decisions about which specific documents to restrict for extended periods and under what authority were themselves documented in ways that are not always accessible in the released portions of the archive. The American National Security Act of 1947 and the subsequent development of the American National Security Classification System created an institutional framework for the management of sensitive information that was applied not only to ongoing operations, but to the historical record of the war that had just ended. Documents from the war years were transferred into the classification framework of the post-war period and were restricted under standards that had not existed when they were produced. The process of declassifying those documents has been ongoing since the 1960s and has not been completed. The Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel and its predecessor organizations have processed hundreds of thousands of declassification requests. Documents continue to be discovered in archives that were incorrectly transferred from temporary to permanent classification, incorrectly transferred between agencies in ways that changed their accessibility, or that were simply misfiled in ways that delayed their discovery by researchers. The war in the Pacific ended with the Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, announced by Emperor Hirohito in a radio address that was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard the emperor's voice. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The institutions that had conducted the war on all sides did not dissolve. They reconstituted themselves, absorbed their experience, classified their documentation, managed their narratives, and continued to function. The people who had made the decisions that the documentation recorded moved into post-war positions within those institutions and within the societies those institutions served. The systems that had enabled the war's conduct persisted, were refined, were transferred, and were applied to new situations in a world that was already dividing into the alignment patterns that would define the next 40 years of global conflict. The paperwork from the war was filed. Some of it was classified, some of it was destroyed, some of it is still being discovered. The institutions are still running.